All right, this is Sean McKay with C-TECC. This little update on our working group on casualty collection points on CCPs for specific to dynamic violent incidents. When we first started this project, the purpose was to develop a working group comprised of various first responder disciplines from law enforcement, fire department, and EMS to start to develop principles for the acquisition and management of CCPs during the civilian response to an active shooter incident or a violent mass cow. During this, we also were to develop a gap analysis of civilian CCP tactics, techniques, and procedures, and analyze the key performance parameters of DoD's CCPs for any applicable utilization in our civilian environment. Part of that was we realized that we definitely have a gap as far as we can't point to multiple successive casualty collection point situations on the civilian side that we can use to model principles after, because the fluency isn't there for this type of situation. So we were fortunate enough to be able to link up with some friends in US SOCOM that have done an enormous amount of CCPs in actual operational instances and gained some really good insight, not necessarily on exactly how they run them or the circumstances they run them under, but the principles, the guiding principles that are out there that we need to do. And I would compare that to the principles within C-TECC is no matter where you go across your disciplines of medicine, from wilderness to regular pre-hospital, traditional pre-hospital, to tactical, to anything like that, the principles remain fairly much the same throughout. Your practices on how you get to your end state in those specific disciplines will change. So at no point are you ever going to find anyone where like, hey, bleeding out is good. You should let somebody bleed out. No matter what discipline you work in or environment you work in, that's not a good thing. How you control that bleeding based on the environment you work on is your practices, and that's how you will manage that situation. So we kind of hit the CCP management in the same way. Is if we can find those principles, then it leaves enough leeway or room for any individual agency out there, depending on what your organic assets are, to be able to meet that in whatever practice you decide you can. So at no point is C-TECC going to say anything about this is how you run a CCP and this is what you need. You need exactly 4 law enforcement officers per 2 fire and 1 EMS and stupid things like that. What we're going to do is give you principles, and how you reach those principles is completely up to your agency and your organic assets that you deal with. So step 1, right, we should not suck at what we do. And it appears that sometimes through, whether it's negligence or just being blindsided, we find ourselves thinking that maybe we're better than what we are. So we kind of took this from Nassim Taleb here on the Platonic fold. Platonic meaning that mindset is we tend to oversimplify things. We look for the easy button, and in that we lose context. And within the context is what sucker punches us during an event, when we bypass that things aren't always what we want them to be. And so the explosive boundary where the Platonic mindset enters in contact with messy reality is where the gap between what you know and what you think you know becomes dangerously wide. It is here that the black swan is produced. So when we look at that, see a couple things at the bottom there. However we plan for things to occur is not how they're going to occur, because we are responding into a nonlinear environment where we can't predict it. And so no matter how much work we work at a round table or on a whiteboard and we talk things out and we think that we got the answer, it doesn't really work that way. Whether you want to use the quote from Tyson where everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth, it's kind of that type of situation. So when we look at Aurora, right, there was some lack in some communication, not really on the same page, and what we had there is really no one really went through CCP type of thing, and the majority of people, as you see on there, are actually transported, just thrown in the back of a police vehicle and transported very quickly. On the left, we have kind of an overarching view of with San Bernardino, which was set up a little bit more typical in a traditional sense for a CCP. This was actually what you see here at that intersection is what their triage treatment area was. That the CCP was actually behind the IRC building, run by the law enforcement with 1 SWAT medic in there. Point being is you never know how you're going to be able to roll out your CCP, how that's going to go, because we can't predict what that environment is going to be. Is the threat still active? Is it not active? Is it an IED? And now we've got to gain quite a bit of space between where a CCP would be and where the target building is. And there's so many different factors in there that there is no way that you can strictly say this is exactly the practices that you have to do. So if we can adhere to as many principles as we can, then at least we know we've got our butts covered in a couple different areas. To start off, we're going to kind of have to get some situational awareness on our environment, which isn't really talked about a whole bunch. So when we look at things being super controlled, laboratory type testing, what we typically will find when we're sitting at a round table doing interagency discussions on how our response plan is going to be, that is typically, those things are based on probability, which is those familiar with the bell curve or Gaussian curve will see that a lot of evidence-based medicine is that when you see any evidence-based medicine that comes out from a tourniquet study or a hemostatic study, we're always going to see a probability factor, 0.05 probability. That is based on a very linear situation where as many variables are taken out so you can test and evaluate one very specific area. Unfortunately, that doesn't translate to real world at all. We have so many different variables, and those variables in many cases are interdependent. So if there's any question whether you think your agency works in a linear or a non-linear environment, what I would ask you is, does one action of a responding agent, is it dependent on something else? So if we think about an active shooter, is the law enforcement's response independent or interdependent on what the threat's doing, or what a potential IED is, or in the case of Columbine with moving threats, is that dependent? And based on that, is the fire department's response dependent on what law enforcement's doing, or EMS's response dependent on what fire department or law enforcement or the threat? And what about the casualties? So what we see here is those are all very interdependent, and you can't really predict any of those. So we work in a nonlinear environment, which is very close to chaos. So, if we want to get technical and talk about parabolic equations greater than 3, we can do that, but we really don't have to. What we realize is we have a bunch of things that are interdependent that we can't predict. And because of that, we can't go in with the idea of this is our very specific game plan on how we're going to do this, or create a acronym like threat and say this is how we're going to handle this situation, because those situations change. If you look at the day before the Las Vegas shooting, how many people were out there training for a guy on the 32nd floor shooting down at a concert with hundreds of thousands of people? Wasn't really there. So we got to feel comfortable understanding that we don't know what we're going to necessarily respond into. So our plans have got to be very adaptable to the environment and what's going on here. So a little bit more essay for some upcoming slides here. We need to understand, right, we're dealing with mass casualty situations when we're talking about this. So, mass casualty, often shortened to an MCI, is any incident in which emergency medical service resources, such as personnel and equipment, are overwhelmed by the number and severity of casualties. As far as pathology of inaccurate perception, this pretty much just is how we do things on a normal basis, and that is why we continue to be somewhat irrelevant and non-productive in those guidelines that are put out there for active shooter responses, because we deny critical aspects of what that incident has organically or innately in it, and that is environmental pathology, which we cannot control. So when we're responding to one of these incidents, it's not like a regular medical call where we get called for chest pains at somebody's residence, and we're dealing basically just with the casualty pathology. What we're dealing with in this case is we've got threats, we've got so many unknowns, and we're dealing with an environmental pathology and a casualty pathology. And if we're incredible medics, but we don't know the first thing about how to organize all these patients and be able to potentially evacuate them out a window or nonlinear, then we have a chance of that patient dying because the environmental pathology helped kill them, because we couldn't manage that. Where if we're awesome rope technicians and we can throw people out windows on webbing and do that type of things, yet we're really have no capability in managing that patient, we still can lose that patient. So this is actually a blended capability where we need to understand the environmental pathology and the capabilities we may need to have to deal with that, along with those critical aspects of managing a casualty in one of these situations and being able to intervene where we can on potentially preventable causes of death. So we need to remember what works really well at one event will probably not even be relevant or work at the next event when we get down into the specifics of it. If we keep it overarching at the principles of what we did, like we had a security platform, we had multiple egresses and ingresses, those are capabilities that we can apply in multiple areas. When we get down to strict SOPs, those are usually things that fall apart because they're very linear. When anything linear, like an algorithm or an SOP, comes in contact with a nonlinear environment, it usually disintegrates very, very quickly. And we've all probably seen or had that happen to us. Once again, the environment is unpredictable and variables are interdependent. We change one variable and everything else downstream and tangentially tends to change. So off to the right there is just some things you can read on your own that talk a little bit about black swan events being an outlier outside the bell curve. So innately, we see the difference between a Gaussian and a power inverse law on this. So, the outlier, those things that occur outside that bell curve or outside that Gaussian curve, are typically thrown out when we deal with that. In our environment, we can't throw those outliers out. We have to be prepared to respond to those. Usually has a large impact, and retrospectively, smart people basically concoct ways to make that unpredictable event more predictable. And that type of mindset typically is what bites us in the butt because we oversimplify the situation and really gain no operational capability when doing AARs. All right, so casualty collection points. What, who, where, when, and how. First thing we probably want to talk about is the threat. When any first responder goes into this environment, the threat becomes fairly obvious, right? We have somebody shooting potentially at us if they're still on scene. Or we may have an explosive device that we consider a threat, obviously, that could injure not just the casualties that are already there, but the first responders and all engaging in that situation. But when we look at how does the first responder engage and what kind of threat does that first responder engage, we start seeing the specialties that occur when we have this convergent model onto one of these scenes of law enforcement, fire, EMS. And when we look at it, law enforcement's capability, innate capability, is dealing with behavioral threats. You can read that where they engage in unpredictable and controlled behavior that is intentional, thinking, and mobile. Threats can change in less than a second, so we're dealing a lot of times in these situations with law enforcement dealing with the behavioral threat of that shooter. They can also come in contact at the same event with not just a shooter, but a potential IED, which then becomes another situational threat that we have to deal with. When we look at fire departments, typically deal with physical threats. That's what they typically mitigate. This is generally uncontrolled energy in 5 or more common forms. This can also be a physical threat of chains on a door like we saw in Virginia Tech, and being able to mitigate those things very quickly. The other physical threat is obviously within the environment is the evacuation of casualties, which may have to be kind of a modified or hasty high angle type of rescue out a second or third story window. And those are kind of that realm of fire department key performance parameters, those things that they deal with as far as their threat. And then when we look at FD in some cases and EMS, that is a physiological threat that is being engaged. And that is typically that casualty dying. And so can we innovate in between that point of wounding to when they typically would die and be able to prolong that, get them transferred and get them to a hospital. So being able to deal in the treatment of the unstable, life-threatening medical conditions of that casualty. So when we look at it this way, we can kind of see how all the things from top down towards the bottom. So we see the quicker that law enforcement can manage or mitigate that behavioral threat, the quicker we can go into the physiological. The quicker that fire can break through the padlocks, breach to get in, be able to evacuate that casualty out a second or third story window, the quicker we can deal with that physiological threat. So in the end, the physiological threat kind of reigns supreme no matter who you are. It just so happens that whatever your wheelhouse capability is moves you quicker, hopefully, to decrease that kind of flash to bang time that we can start managing the criticality of these patients. All right, so here we go, getting into some CCPs. A little props out to Public Enemy. Don't believe the hype. There's a lot of craziness that gets talked about in lectures and briefed on, and not always valid in the statements. So when we look at a CCP for dynamic acts of violence, they do not have the same key performance parameters as our typical CCPs that we all had to do in first responder, EMT, or paramedic school, which is typically based on the motor vehicle accident, motor vehicle crash type of situation where here's a bunch of vehicles, let's cut off traffic, we're going to lay our tarps out, we're going to get all our equipment out, we're going to move through and manage the CCP. Anybody who can walk, please walk over here. And that typical thing is it's a different context for the dynamic incident that we're talking about with violence. So when we talk about a CCP as a CCP attitude, that's actually not really a thing. It's not. And even a CCP within an active shooter event is not the same as the next active shooter event or the next active shooter event, because there's too many things there that we cannot control. So on a motor vehicle crash, we try and control as many parameters as we can, right? So we're cutting traffic off so we don't have other vehicles coming around causing additional hazards and things like this. We try and move in and get LZs as close as we can to be able to fly people out. We have this organizational capability that we're able to do. When we're dealing with the high threat environment, when there's so many unknowns, we don't have that capability. There's too many variables that are still out there. So it's always going to differ from one event to another. What we have to be comfortable with doing is working in an uncontrolled environment. When we're going on, there's to continue that, neither is CCP inertia. We kind of gave that quote or that saying that was created a few years back. It really never caught on, thank God. But it's interesting because we get people that want to bring science into it, and unfortunately we start bringing science into it and applying it the wrong way, or we just don't have an understanding of what we're even talking about. So the concept behind that, in case you've ever heard this or heard it briefed, is actually based in really nothing of truth, pretty much complete BS. So when we look at CCP inertia, that says that if we take the time to do CCPs, it actually slows down getting that patient out to a hospital, and that we should pretty much consider alleviating CCPs and basically just grab patients and leave, which is an interesting concept because there's no validity behind it, nor is there any science. What's interesting about that is, at the nature of what we're talking about, is we're going to do a casualty collection point during a mass casualty incident. If we go back a couple slides, we see that for it to be called a mass casualty incident, we are already organically depleted of our assets. We don't have the assets, whether it's personnel or whether it is equipment, capabilities, transports, whatever. We don't have those available to us to be able to get people effectively off the scene, deal with their injuries, and get them to the appropriate facility. So right off the bat, defined within mass casualty situation, pretty much alleviates or completely crushes the entire CCP inertia. If we want to get more critical, we're dealing in a nonlinear environment. Inertia is actually a Newtonian physics type of term, which doesn't exist in its form that we normally accept it when it goes into nonlinearity. So right from a science standpoint, it's like me asking you to solve a quadratic formula using the alphabet. That's not really a thing at all. So at its most elementary type of understanding, it's pretty much complete kind of a crock. So don't fall down lines like that. Use your common sense. Active shooter IED response has not only casualty pathology, but environmental pathology, as we spoke of before. And when we get into this, that's where this kind of comes in. So when we look at CCPs demystified, what is a casualty collection point? Basically, in its purest method, it's a control measure. It's a tool to create clarity within chaos. It's a critical point in the continuum of care for those casualties. It's a step-off location, and it's a common point link-up between systems. What is common to all CCPs? Typically, what we got to do is put this into context is when we look at these bullet points, it would be awesome for us to be able to check each one off when we do a CCP. The reality of that is that's probably not going to happen. So for those of you who've done rope rescue or you've done mountain rescue, high angle and things like this, there's the earnest off to the side there, which is an acronym on how to develop anchors when you're climbing or you're doing mountain rescue. So they're equalized, they're redundant, they're non-extending, they're strong, they're timely. Realizing that doing anchors in mountain rescue, especially hasty mountain rescue, you're never going to check off each one of those. What you're going to do is kind of balance it and see what's really important, what you can do, and then what's just impossible to do. And you're going to try and maximize what you can, and the rest you just sometimes can't do anything about. So that's very similar to what we're talking about here with the common aspects. So security is a big, kind of an important thing, right? And anything that we do in that environment. So some sort of security capability around that CCP with eyes looking out is vitally important. Some sort of easy identification from inside and outside markings. That may be chem lights, that may be little disposable strobes, whatever that is. It could be stickers in windows. We need some sort of marking to be able to put that into its system so we can get ingress, egress assets. Everybody knows where you are and how to help you evacuate these people. Command and control integration is a must. An effective workspace, and we're going to talk about these things in detail here on another slide. An effective workspace and a rapid evacuation capability, whether that's just rapidly evacuating the casualties, or that may be that all of a sudden somebody found a suspicious package or a backpack with wires, and now it's right outside the door of your CCP, and you've got to move very, very quickly with casualties with no delay. So breaking this down a little bit more, security, we need to use our words wisely, right? Semantics are a thing. So when we deal with law enforcement, EMS, and fire, even simple things of saying something's clear has different meanings to different groups. So when we say things like security, law enforcement needs to understand not only are our security for this, if something goes down, you can't leave us, right? Because we're kind of hanging it out here with no guns, and we're kind of focused in on medical care. So we need to really define even what the roles and responsibilities are for that person providing security, because it becomes almost more like a protective security detail for fire and EMS, where they need to keep their head on a swivel, being able to look for any threats because you're engaging in that casualty care or casualty evacuation. And if something does go down, their initial stance may be to run to that problem, start mitigating it. But with other assets on scene, they need to start feeling comfortable. Even if shots are being fired and an explosion goes off, they need to stay with the EMS and fire personnel during that CCP, or else we're going to kind of hang them out to dry. Easy identification from inside and outside, like we said before, this could be disposable strobes, chem lights, etc. Some sort of marking system where when we need assets to come up and help us get people, let's say, off a second or third story, that they can reasonably quickly identify where we're at and where we need them to be. Command and control integration needs an operational level of understanding of at least what you're accomplishing with a CCP, where the location or locations are. We can have multiple CCPs. An event, what that casualty flow looks like, where and what direction it's going to, what assets are needed to accomplish that task, and what kind of evacuation options we have for those casualties out of the CCP and hopefully en route very quickly to a medical treatment facility. Effective workspace. So when we look at that, we can look at some of the looks. Like if we look at Virginia Tech, one of those CCPs was set up in the stairwell, very, very small area. So a lot of times we misjudge exactly how much room we need to be able to start taking care of somebody with enough room to be able to package them and then be able to evacuate them. But in our little area that we're working on somebody, we may have a bag, may have a box, may have whatever we're working out of, which takes up room. We need the ability to kind of roll that casualty around and be able to do a good assessment on them, being able to package them, putting them on a soft litter, hard litter, or Skedco, whatever you're using, a Foxtrot. And that all takes room. So when you look at that, what is that room? So if we're looking at the average high school student to college student, and we try to figure out how much room do we need, it kind of breaks down from square footage to be about the size of a regular sized couch in a living room. It's about that much room that you will need to be able to get multiple people in there. So when you're talking to the police department or whatever, and you're looking for a way for them to choose an effective or tactical selected CCP, basically just let them know that each patient, you need about as much room as what you see in like a living room couch to be able to work with your med kit, be able to package them, roll them, and do what you need to do. As far as a rapid evacuation capability, what is your evac plan? From a single story, it could be very easy, right? Just dragging them out. Maybe we need some sort of friction medium device. like even cutting a carpet around them and dragging them out, or a specialty item like a foxtrot or anything like that, will work. Once we get onto a second or third story, we look at Virginia Tech, or we look at the Naval Yard and things like this. Now we may need to get more inventive, where we may need a very hasty high angle capability. So we need to think about what that is and how can we effectively do that very quickly, very easy, non-complex, non-technical, and get that done. The other side of it is, what if a potential explosive is identified outside your CCP? So if you're on the second floor of, let's say, Virginia Tech, and you've got 6 patients inside that you're working on, you're trying to manage getting people to take them down the stairs, or maybe you're a little proactive and you're getting them out the window, and all of a sudden somebody hits up that there's a suspicious package outside that door. Because you have thought about multiple means of ingress and egress, you should be in a pretty good position to where hopefully with enough assets you can get people out very quickly. But if we didn't think about that and we chose a CCP that was just one door, right? It's the door from the hallway in and to this classroom or an office in an office building. That could really suck for us at that point, right? So if that package is right outside that door, that means that those 6 patients I'm working on, plus my crews, are all going to have to go straight past the suspicious package to rapidly try and get these people out. Where if we had multiple means of egress, then our options open up a little bit more for us. So what a CCP is at a basic level, a CCP is a control point. Basically, the term is no different than a primary breach, HLZ, helicopter landing zone, or a fallout point, where all of a sudden explosives found and we fall out to this point. It's kind of the oh shit spot. These are all control points that are planned for and placed based off of the location of the target building. A lot of times it's done in real time. So as we're responding, we may get an idea, or we may be familiar with where we're responding to, but until we realize what that environmental pathology is, where the threats are, what are the threats, we can't say for sure, okay, this is going to be where the CCP is, this is where the triage treatment area is, this is where we're doing it. And it's a dynamic situation, so until we get there, we really can't make this, but it's in the forefront of our thoughts. So it's kind of in real time that these decisions are being made. For what the real specific control point is controlling, as well as the optimum ingress and egress from these points to other control points. So we have a breach point, which controls where teams enter and exit a building. HLZs control where air assets meet up with personnel on the ground. Fallout points control where personnel inside the target building fall back to in the event of an emergency. And then CCPs control the flow of patients, medical personnel, and medical supplies. So it's a way of controlling that situation, getting your head above water, and seeing a little bit more clear on not just what benefits the overall situation, what benefits the casualty, to what hospital, and the medical procedures that can be done in that continuum. The purpose of a control point is to guide teams to the right area. They are especially important in the ambiguous and dynamic nature of the active shooter IED mass casualty incident. Control points allow teams to regroup, reorganize, and regain the initiative for the tactical, medical, and rescue problems that are present in these situations. CCPs are the friction point between lots of organizations. So this is kind of where worlds collide. So this is that one area that may be the first point of contact where law enforcement, fire, and EMS all have to integrate together. And if they're not on the same page, that is where this potentially becomes a friction point. If they're not kind of singing off the same sheet of music, we may have problems. And this is probably where that one first domino could find itself or rear its head. So it's the friction point between lots of organizations, law enforcement, fire, and EMS, in an ambiguous tactical and medical problem, because we still don't know really probably at this situation what even is going on. Is the shooter dead? Did they make a run for it? Is there more than one shooter, 2 shooters, 3 shooters? Is there a potential IED? All these things are still going out. We're hearing things over the radio. Nothing is concrete because it's still unfolding dynamics. So we're having to make decisions on either no information, potentially inaccurate information, or very limited information. So as this is going, we've got to try and maintain some sort of clarity in this. So having a smooth operational flow and training will prevent the chaos from progressing into a crisis during a real-world situation. Typically, CCP operations start off chaotic, but a well-drilled team will be able to take charge and bring some order into that chaos very quickly. If all the units involved understand the basics of what a CCP needs to function and reach an operational outcome, things will be a lot smoother than if not. Everyone involved in an active shooter MCI needs to have the ability to perform a basic march. So whether you're law enforcement, EMT, paramedic, need to have that capability of doing a real quick march assessment, be able to apply a tourniquet, pack a bleeder, be able to employ a positional airway, throwing somebody on the recovery position, maybe stick something over a hole in the chest, keeping in mind something in an exit wound, and keep a casualty warm. Probably based on the 30 years of data that Reed brought out, what we've recently found out in San Bernardino, what we've talked to some of the folks in Las Vegas on, is we are always hearing the capability of being able to stop a bleed, tourniquets. As most of the people listening to this have probably read, that's not the wound of the active shooter incident in the United States. Is not a wound that an extremity tourniquet is going to manage. We don't see a whole bunch of them at all. What we do see a whole bunch of is thoracic injuries. And so to be able to understand from the law enforcement all the way up to the paramedic that if somebody's shot inside that box, in that chest and in that truncal area, that we don't know what the heck's going on in there, and we need to get them off scene and to a hospital ASAP, and probably into a surgeon very, very quickly. So that is the wound we see a whole bunch. So we can't really probably put more criticality on top of being able to identify and understand that a wound inside the box is extremely critical. Communicate with the medics in simple verbiage, the injuries and condition of the patient they just did the assessment on. So we need to have that interface between law enforcement being able to tell the incoming EMTs or paramedics, fire, what they've done, what they've seen on these patients, and what kind of modalities or treatment modalities they have done, and where they believe the patient is right now as far as criticality or severity. Law enforcement, FD, EMTs, and medics must feel comfortable really engaging chaos and make decisions when information may be lacking. And obviously this goes back into the whole OODA loop or Boyd cycle, to be able to engage and decide, act, and then based on that response, either sustain or change course. So ending thoughts, ending this up, we need to become a student of your craft. Research and utilize high reliability organizing principles when creating and training for your responses. As a responder, we got to feel comfortable working within chaos and uncertainty. We can always look back on an incident with hindsight and armchair quarterback the crap out of instances, which is obviously not good, not relevant. But realize that when you're making these decisions in real time, you do not have much information. You are engaging, constantly trying to engage and gain clarity during this. So you need to feel comfortable being uncomfortable in these instances. There is no response algorithm, mnemonic, cheat sheet that's going to help you through any of these, because every instance is going to be different. And what that mnemonic or cool thing was for Virginia Tech or for Sandy Hook response is not going to be relevant for the response in Las Vegas or the response to the next incident. So we can't become reliant on that. We just need to know and train on principles, capabilities, and all those capabilities we need to be able to call audibles based on what the environment throws at us. Don't get hung up on whether your CCP is inside or outside, whether it's hasty, dynamic, whether you got to make it mobile or static, or you Alamo it. Make it work based on how the situation unfolds, what you're able to do with your own organic assets that you have, and what allows you to reach the optimal end state. So in the end, CCPs are critical for getting your head above water and obtaining a semi-accurate picture of your medical asset requirement, allocating your resources and assets effectively and appropriately, and then being able to transport and dispersing patients to the correct facility, and that without overwhelming one hospital versus another, or sending people to the trauma center that don't belong there, etc. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We're still developing a lot of these things and finalizing this out. So I appreciate your time. If you have any interest in being a part of this working group, feel free to email me at Sean@ElementRescue, or hit us up from the C-TECC.org website under the contact page and send us an email if you have any interest in being part of this. Thanks.